Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon session. My name is Nell Moloja, and William Blankley and I are going to chair this session, which we entitled A Science of Science and Innovation Policy. We are both from the Center for Science, Technology and Innovation Indicators in Cape Town, based at the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa. A brief history of this research topic is that John Marburger, then science advisor to President Bush, advocated the development of a new social science 5 years ago. The proposal was made in various presentations, including one he made to the OECD Blue Sky 2 Forum in 2006. This was published in 2007 by the OECD as Science, Technology, and Innovation Indicators in a Changing World, Responding to Policy Needs. The National Science Foundation launched the Science of Science and Innovation Policy Program, which is now in its third solicitation and is beginning to build a community of practice. This program is led by Julia Lane, who is at this conference. This conference is a contribution to the debate on the development of a science of science and innovation policy. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to have speakers from a variety of background and interests, and should provide interesting perspectives from their research experiences in this area. In the interest of time, we did indicate to our speakers that they will have 20 minutes each for their presentations, but we would like to have a panel discussion at the end of this session. So we are asking the speakers to please limit your presentation to 15 minutes each. We'll take questions at the end of the session. Now, I have great pleasure in introducing our first speaker, Dr. Fred Gold, currently a visiting fellow at the IDRC. He is a former chair of the OECD Working Party of National Experts on Science and Technology Indicators, NESTI, and a member of the management team for the OECD Innovation. His topic is entitled R&D and Innovation Service. Please welcome Dr. Gold.
Thank you. Now, all I need is a presentation, which I'm sure is here somewhere, and I will do this in 15 minutes, which is what I've promised to do. That one. Brilliant. Right, this is encouraging. So it's going to go very, very quickly. I am talking about the difficulties of shaping the future, and I'm sure you all know that the future is difficult to shape. What I am going to do is talk a bit about the science of science policy, or innovation policy, then about innovation, which gets me into measurement. I will draw out of that some stylized facts, which will raise some policy questions. I'll then disappear back into measurement and reemerge with the odd research question, and then try to shape the future. And there will be additional material, and I assume my slides are available for people who want them. The problem, and if not, send me an email. The problem with the science of policy is that it is a difficult subject. We've had political scientists trying to explain government to us for a very long time, and we've had Aristotle and Plato, we've had Marx, we've had others, and we've tried to establish some basic principles for analysis, Newton's laws, if you want to take a physical science approach, methods and frameworks, then the building of models, the feeding of those models with data derived from reproducible measurements in order to understand what we are trying to do, which is to make predictions. That is what science does, is give you a robust means of making predictions. Now, one of the problems with dealing with the science of innovation policy is that innovation is spread over a time period. It starts, it diffuses, it has social and economic impacts, and it becomes a little difficult to frame a policy not just about the activities, but about the longer-term impacts. So that is a challenge. I'd like you to hold that challenge while I move on and talk about shaping the future. R&D I'm going to dismiss because we've been measuring it for 50-odd years using the Frascati manual definitions, which haven't changed. And on the whole, we think we know what we're doing. And we have the Lisbon target in Europe, 3% of gross domestic product allocated to R&D, of which 2% from business enterprise. And that is certainly shaping behavior in Europe, and in Africa, 1% is the target. Let us turn, therefore, to innovation measurement and the future, and ask initially if innovation itself can be measured. Well, innovation, before we talk about whether it can be measured, we will look at its definition. And I am using the most recent version of the Oslo Manual, downloadable from the OECD, as a new or significantly improved product, and that's a good or a service, national accounting language, delivered to the market, a process for producing or delivering product for the market, for the social sciences present, organizational change or use of management practices supporting product or process links to the market or market development. Do you notice a word recurring in that definition? I hope so, because without that word, we're not talking about the activity of innovation. Hold that thought. Off we go. Now, measurement. People played a lot of interesting games in the 70s and 80s trying to measure the activity of innovation in business. Some work in Canada, Germany, most of the Nordic countries, and then in the US. They haven't done innovation measurement for a very long time. January of this year, they went into the field with the first innovation survey that will produce official statistics in the US, a major step. By the early 90s, we were in a position where we could codify the knowledge that had been gained by these experiments, and with the help of the Nordic Council, we produced the first, not surprisingly, Oslo Manual because of the influence of the Nordic Council, which was revised in 1997 again in 2005. And we've been producing official statistics for quite some time. The community innovation surveys in Europe, surveys in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, have produced official statistics on the activity of innovation. Notice I keep saying the activity of innovation, and you'll see why in a moment. So the significant revision of the Oslo Manual I've just shown you brought in social practices, which are key to innovation. So for statistical purposes, innovation can be measured. That's the message. Stylized findings. When you go out and do an innovation survey, you find a couple of robust findings, one of which is the propensity to innovate is greater than the propensity to do research and development. More firms do innovation than do R&D. That is a message I would like you to absorb. The question then is, where does the knowledge come from for those firms which are innovating, putting new product on the street, for example, when they are not doing research and development? That is an important issue. Where do they get information from? Well, they get information from a variety of sources. A lot comes from within the firm. From external sources, you see and Erich von Hippel told us this 20 years ago, that the information is coming from the clients, the suppliers, competitors. There's a whole range of other places where information comes from, but when you get to the bottom of that list, you find that the least used sources are government laboratories and universities. Sense a policy issue coming. The level of use is dependent on size of firm. It goes up with size of firm, but on the whole, the ranking order remains the same. So policy questions then. How do we improve the knowledge flows leading to value creation? And then once you start studying that, we get back to the issues of the science of the policy. What robust principles are going to guide us in developing this policy? How to promote innovation activities. Notice I've just switched those words around. Innovation activities, and there is a list of innovation activities, do not necessarily constitute the activity of innovation. Innovation is putting product on the street. These are things which can go on within the firm, which do not have to lead to putting product on the street. They help, but they may not do it, in which case you can do all of those things and not do innovation. So classification and measurement, in order to deal with all of this, we take a systems approach. You'll find that in the Oslo Manual. You'll find that in Herbert Simon, those of you who are old enough to remember Herbert Simon, The Science of the Artificial. Actors, governments, business enterprise, higher education, engaged in activities, I've just given you a list, linking to one another, grants, contracts, collaboration, moving of people around, giving rise to outcomes, perhaps a greater percentage of the market, impacts, perhaps increased employment and welfare. Let me pause for a moment and talk about the financial crisis. The financial crisis is an example of innovation in financial services, producing derivatives which were put on the street, a classic innovation. The derivatives diffused rapidly throughout the world economy and then self-destructed. Fascinating. We now have social and economic, if you have a pension plan, you understand what I'm saying, impacts. The message here is that innovation is not necessarily good, nor is it necessarily bad. These words open up a whole new dimension. The systems approach provides a framework for classification, but also a structure for modeling dynamics. Now, another message. Dynamic equilibrium is totally different from static equilibrium in physical systems. So it is important in the world today to understand dynamics. Not many people do. But we must measure linkages, the transmission, the absorption of knowledge. So that gives us some research questions, the role of knowledge sources other than R&D, and that's particularly important in developing countries where a lot of clever people put product on the street without running an R&D unit. So we want to understand learning by doing and learning by using and incorporating indigenous knowledge where appropriate and drawing upon network capital. Everyone in this room can do things that you could not otherwise do because you've got friends who know things, or you've run into people at meetings like this, and that is a network. And what's stored in that network is a capital service or a capital good. The impact also of user-initiated innovation, we're seeing a lot more evidence of user-initiated innovation. I'm not going to talk about it. You can read the paper. But what Eric and I found was that users who innovate have a tendency to freely reveal the intellectual property. Free revealing is a lot more economically efficient than setting up monopolies with patents. And that raises some very serious policy issues for intellectual property, relevant in development studies. So shaping the future, back to shaping the future, and I'm almost done, Chairman, before you throw me off the podium. Our challenge is to raise awareness of innovation among decision makers, get them away from the linear model, away from thinking that research and development is innovation. Innovation is something entirely, well, not entirely different, but contains a lot more than R&D. To recognize other sources in innovation, users matter, and understanding how users influence the process of innovation is quite important. And to develop the science of science and innovation policy mentioned by our chair, a new academic subject, and this really is a challenge to this meeting with a wider discourse. And this is what Jack Marburger wanted when he was advising the previous president of the United States. And the NSF, the National Science Foundation in the United States, is building a community of practice around the science of science and innovation policy. You have the website. Challenges then. Give the minister of whatever he or she is called in your country, industry, education, research, science, comparable tools and advice to those available to the Minister of Finance. The last time I said that to somebody from the back row came a cry, yeah, but he should get it right. Good point. I take that point. Get to the staff of the minister to work with the tools. That's harder than getting to the minister. They are a little more conservative. And build a community of practice able to criticize policy and the methods for shaping the future. So I've tried to put all those things into one presentation in 15 minutes. I think I've done it, Chairman. And there's the additional material, but if you want it, send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Colt, for the inspiring talk, and I hope that people have taken the message. Our next speaker is Professor Müller, a senior researcher at the ZEW Center for European Economic Research in Germany. She will be speaking to us about the contribution of entrepreneurs from low-skilled immigrant groups to innovative activity in the host country. Evidence from Germany. Welcome, Dr. Müller.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. The title of my talk is Immigrant Entrepreneurs in Knowledge-Intensive Industries. Are they different from native Germans? I want to give you some background information. The share of the population with immigrant background in Germany is quite high. It's around 18%. So it's important to know what this population is doing and how this part of the population is contributing to the innovative activities in the German economy. We can take as motivation that innovation is important for economic growth, and we can also take as motivation that Germany has an aging population where in future we might have a lack of entrepreneurs, and take as motivation that the population with immigrant background is on average younger, and then we see that it's quite important to get a good view on how this part of our population is contributing to the innovative success. And so far I have to say that there is not much knowledge about this specific type of our population. As background, I want to give you some facts on the recent immigration history in Germany. When you start with the 1950s, we did not have many foreigners in the country, only 500,000. And then during the economic miracle, a labor shortage developed, and there were several recruitment agreements signed with other countries, among them Italy, Spain, Greece, Turkey, Portugal, and Yugoslavia, to increase the supply of labor in Germany. And this was mainly workers in low-skilled jobs in factories. Then in '73, with around 4 million guest workers, and it was originally planned that they would return home after a certain amount of time. So originally there was no effort to integrate them in the German society. And then there's a second immigration wave in the 90s, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, where ethnic Germans returned from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But for this study, I will focus on the first immigration wave. And they are interesting to study together because they are quite homogeneous with respect to the time when they arrived in Germany, their first experience independent labor, and they were quite homogeneous in their education level. Since they came to Germany to work in low-skilled jobs, they typically had also a low education level. Then I will use two information sources to shed light on this group. From the national statistics, we can get information on the size of this group, the educational background, and company ownership. And then I will use information from a credit rating agency to go into more detail and see how the immigrants as entrepreneurs are active in founding companies, how their companies survive, and how active they are in patenting. In comparison to the earlier talk, we cannot observe whether they are innovative if they give a product to the markets, and we cannot observe R&D activity, but we can have information on patents as an outcome of their activities. Yeah, then quite quickly we focus on immigration background and not nationality, because we think this is more important. It shapes the social background, and discrimination may be more related to ethnicity than to nationality. So for the next few slides, immigration background will include persons with a foreign nationality, with German nationality, but born outside Germany, and without own immigration experience, but where the parents or grandparents were born abroad. Then to give you an idea of how important this group is for Germany, we have a total population of 82 million, of which about 15 million have an immigration background. And of this group, the immigrants with immigration background from the former recruitment countries is about half, and the most important countries are Turkey and ex-Yugoslavia. Then Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union is with 18% also quite important. Since we want to look at entrepreneurial activity, and mostly entrepreneurial activity in high technology, in knowledge-intensive industries, the education level is quite important, because typically founders have a university degree when they found in industries like software or the pharmaceutical industry. Then from a comparison of native Germans and immigrants from recruitment countries, you can observe that the share of the population with no school degree is much lower for native Germans with 2% than for the immigrants with 23%. Then these differences persist basically everywhere. High school degree is more likely for Germans, and what is quite important for the knowledge-intensive industries. If you look at university degree, then you see that the natives, 7% of them have a university degree, whereas this is only 2.7% for this immigrant group. Then I want to focus on the industries where entrepreneurs in general found. You see that knowledge-intensive industries are not so common. For native Germans, only 15% of companies are founded in knowledge-intensive industries. And if you look at immigrants from recruitment countries, then this is only half. So, and it's about, again, then half for manufacturing and services. So you see that, the population group with immigrant background is only half as likely to found in knowledge-intensive industries. Then, because the national statistics do not provide good information on this population group, I constructed an own data set where I used data from a credit rating agency and also from the European Patent Office. Okay, that should suffice. This data does not have any information on nationality on immigration background. So what I did is I used the first and last name of the owners to code their ethnic background. And you see here some examples how this has been done. There is a market research agency that is doing this coding for direct mailing activities. And then from the names of the entrepreneurs, you can infer their background. And this market research company said that about in 5% of cases this coding is not correct. So you have to keep in mind that this is more a probabilistic approach, but I think that overall it gives some valuable information. Okay. This is very descriptive statistics on the companies that are used. On average, they have 3 employees, 4 years old, founded after 98. Then you see that about 3% of them have only owners with immigrant background, and 1.6% have owners with immigrant background and also German owners. Then it's interesting to compare the size of the companies when founded, because this gives a reflection on the resources that the entrepreneurs have available. For this, it's important to control for the number of owners, since this is closely related with the owner types. So if we take all companies together here, number of owners larger or equal than 1, then you see that there is no size difference if you take all knowledge-intensive industries together. But once you only look at manufacturing, then you see that the companies with immigrant participation are smaller. And now this could be an indication that there is a lack of financial resources, because the manufacturing sector has the higher investment requirements. Then if you go to other groups of number of owners, it's basically the same result. The next interesting question is company survival. Once companies are founded, how well are they doing? Here I just give a verbal description of the results. I do basically a Cox regression model with some other controls. And what I find in the end is that companies with only immigrant owner or with a mix of immigrant and German owners have a shorter survival time. And the only exception is for the manufacturing sectors when Germans and immigrants form a partnership. So what we can learn from here is that immigrants may take the risk of founding more easily. It is always the prejudice that Germans are quite risk averse and will not found a company. But the immigrants may also be less rigorous in their business planning. Then from this data, I also know that immigrants start companies at a younger age, and therefore they may have higher risk of going out of business because they started with less experience. Then the next step is the contribution to the patenting activity of Germany as an outcome variable of the innovative success. Here I estimate the probability that a patent is applied for, and what we see is that the company size is quite important. If I control for the company size, the number of owners for example, as well, then there is no difference between the Germans and the immigrants in filing for patents. So if immigrants work with the same resources, they have the same probability of being successful with patenting. And as a quick summary, the economic growth in Germany would benefit from higher entrepreneurial activity in knowledge-intensive industries. And we have seen that immigrants are less likely to found a company in one of those industries. So I think that a first step would be to improve the education level of this group, because we can see that even in the second and third generation, the education level of these immigrants is lower than the German average. And access to financial resources is a potential topic that deserves further investigation. And I think it's encouraging to see that if immigrants work with the same resources, they are as successful as Germans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Miller. Thank you for your talk. Our next speaker is T.T. Srikumar. He's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the National University of Singapore. And he's going to speak to us about innovation in the rural network society, a social science perspective on ICTs and development approaches. Welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation that provided me this opportunity to attend this conference and also present some of the findings of a large study that I've been carrying out, particularly based on some fieldwork in South Asia, focusing on the civil society-based interventions to deploy information and communication technologies for rural development. ICTs and development is an emerging area of study, the legitimacy of which is still deeply debated. In this particular exposition, I will try to provide some basic observations on the nature of social innovation that marked the efforts to deploy information communication technologies in rural societies and the kind of impact that it had, or the kind of approaches that people have taken to understand the nature of the impacts of such interventions in rural societies. So one of the issues that has prominently figured in the debate is to address the challenges of deploying appropriate information communication technologies. Appropriate technology is something that is widely known and debated, whereas in the case of information communication technologies, this concept is still being evoked only very rarely. And then one of the kind of premises of the understanding the relationship between ICTs and development is the whole question that ICTs can actually positively be used for both economic and social transformation in rural areas. And wherever appropriate technology was not available, the onus was on these social innovators to generate appropriate technologies for relevant projects that could be implemented. And then what were the type of agencies that could be mobilized for patterning the kind of innovations imagined is a major question that we need to address. Before that, I would like to give a kind of comparison between the two major approaches in this area. The ICT 4D, which is kind of which has ignited kind of popular imagination, particularly media imagination, generating a whole lot of interest in national and international media on these initiatives. The ICT 4D approach, there is a presumption that ICTs necessarily lead to development, whereas there are a lot of ground level evidence that suggests to the contrary. There are areas where introduction of information communication technologies have not really created, not really bridged divides. On the other hand, it has accentuated existing divides and also created new divides. So the unidirectional relationship between ICTs and development that is presumed in the ICT 4D approach is discarded in the ICT and D approach, where ICT-D as an area raises practical and theoretical questions relating to state, civil society, market relationships, and interactions in the domain of ICT-based development initiatives. I'll quickly run through the slide. I mean, on the one hand, we have the ICT 4D discourse, which essentially glorifies these interventions and then comes up with exaggerated, kind of reports about the success of these initiatives, whereas the actual, ground level reality will point to the need for an approach that attempts to understand these new technologies in the rural landscape as some kind of a socio-technical process of great importance and multiple meanings. And then ICT 4D literature is biased towards the supply side and gives scant attention to the demand, whereas ICTD as a discipline questions the belief that only imperative to overcome the demand problem is added emphasis on the role of awareness building, conscious design, and incorporation of social concerns. I mean, these things will not resolve the issues under focus. And then ICT 4D approach views the question of social inclusion and participation as fundamentally a matter of choice rather than structure, whereas ICTD looks at the question of diffusion from below. Attention is focused on the overarching structures of social barriers that appear to be far more constraining in the Asian rural city. There are a whole lot of actors, who are involved in this, the state, university, the private sector, and also, most importantly, civil society organizations have come in a big way in initiating such experiments, like community activists, citizen groups, donor-dependent NGOs. A welter of such experiments are now proliferating in developing countries. They actually kind of claim to enhance employment opportunities, generate income streams for alleviating poverty, empower subaltern classes like Dalits or women, create sustainable livelihood, strengthen neighborhood ties, support e-governance, help overcome cultural isolation, combat exclusion and deprivation. These are the kind of claims that they have made over time. And there are hybrid agents like cross-sector engagements, like the NGO sector is not a pure domain of voluntary activity. There are active intervention by the state in the domain of civil society. Many bureaucrats actually, kind of take off from their bureaucratic commitments and become directors or CEOs of civil society organizations. The state still have a major control over these organizations through these bureaucrats, and so there are cross-sector engagements that are quite interesting. There are basically three kinds of technologies that are involved here. One is the user interface one, then another is the one is the terminal equipment for user interface, and the third is the equipment and software for transmission technologies. And these are the kind of things that we have seen in these programs. Basically, it can be kind of classified into these three groups. All the rural social interventions to deploy information communication technologies can be largely classified into these three basic units. So the question here is to, is how we can understand the nature of innovation and technology diffusion in projects initiated by civil society organizations, and what are the implications for the conceptualization of innovation systems when civil society becomes a key element of the system. Most of the development interventions based on information communication technologies try to provide individuals a direct access to technology. So the protocols of delivery mechanisms become dominated by a high level of technology applications. Innovations thus formed a major aspect of defining the nature of innovations themselves. The technological content of the proposed projects were imagined to be playing a crucial part in facilitating these interventions. But at the same time, these civil society organizations were not a kind of recognized part of the conventional kind of organizational structure of innovation systems. So they could not generally exploit the feedback loops or benefit from a positive response from major players in the existing innovation system, including organizations such as state, R&D laboratories, universities, or industrial R&D. It was a kind of a messy relationship that the civil society organization developed with the rest of the actors in the innovation system. So hence, all innovations demanded certain degree of coordination of CSOs with major traditional players of the national innovation system, and this was, sometimes quite messy. One of the kind of example is the telecenter movement, which actually began in Scandinavia in the 80s. Like Association of Nordic Telecottages, International Union of Telecottages, and all those institutions and organizations were quite prominent in the 80s in the Scandinavian countries. And this was the experiment which was kind of replanted in developing countries in the 90s, particularly in Asia. Most of these projects, I mean, the difference between the Scandinavian initiative and the Asian initiative is quite instructive. The kind of autonomy that the Scandinavian initiative enjoyed obviously was not available for the Asian initiatives. They were essentially donor-driven projects initiated by hybrid actors, received unprecedented international media attention, unlike the Scandinavian initiative, and then it also kind of tend to redefine the whole development rhetoric called ICT 4D. The kind of questions that the kind of challenges that these initiatives had to kind of tackle initially were limited local participation, lack of availability of local resources, fractured relation with the state and the agencies, a limited integration with social movements, elite capture of the technology. I mean, this happens all the time in rural areas. I mean, once a new technology is kind of deployed in a rural setting, the major claim that is made on behalf of the technology is that it helps empowerment of the rural poor. On the other hand, there is ample evidence from South Asia that the new technology is being captured by the rural elite and put to their own use. I mean, the myths about elimination of middlemen and then kind of elimination of hierarchies in rural areas because of the introduction of new technologies is at best a myth. And also the ad hocism of donor-centered initiatives. I mean, many of the donor agencies would be initially interested in funding a particular project in a particular locality, and afterwards, they will lose interest in that project, and then they will walk out, and then this agency doesn't know how to proceed in with the kind of project that they have initiated. Now I'll try to kind of compare this so-called information revolution imagined in the media based on these ICT initiatives with green revolution, which preceded this information revolution in India. Both from the point of view of understanding the social dynamics and also the kind of impact that it had on the society, green revolution and information technology is very instructive if we compare them together. The Green Revolution marked the first large-scale incursion of modern technologies in the Indian countryside. On the one hand, it had revolutionized Indian agricultural practices, helped India become self-sufficient in food production, and created opportunities for off-farm and non-farm activities that changed the historical conditions of agricultural operations in the rural setting. Again, Green Revolution attracted several scholarly studies which brought out a welter of unrevealed dimensions of social and economic changes triggered by new sets of agrarian technologies. There were studies on labor absorption potential of these technologies, studies on the changes in social and class relations, studies on its impact on capital formation, on agrarian trade unions, changes in the agrarian governance, efficiency, competitiveness, and the kind of changes that it brought about in the rural markets. On the other hand, when we come to the information revolution, none of this is seen. There are only anecdotal narratives of the success of the major initiatives, and even in cases where the anecdotes pointed to employment creation in villages, there were no studies on the labor absorption capabilities of rural ICTs. The only exception is Robert Jensen's study of the use of mobile phones by Kerala fish workers. And then while anecdotes pointed to the increase in the productivity and efficiency due to ICT use, there were absolutely no analytical studies that empirically corroborated these anecdotal evidences. And when the anecdotes were actually pointing to the empowerment of the poor, women, and weaker sections, there were absolutely no critical studies that pointed to the macro or village level impacts of ICTs on caste, class, or other social hierarchies. And my own fieldwork in Madhya Pradesh, in Punjab, in Pondicherry, in Kerala, in Karnataka, and a few other parts in India actually revealed that these anecdotes are actually exceptions, and sometimes if you really go into the details of those stories, actually such stories do not exist. I mean, I have in another study clearly shown that one of the New York Times report, on a particular case in India about empowerment of women and also empowerment of Dalits was absolutely baseless. I mean, there was actually, other than the NGOs kind of reporting about these developments, there was absolutely no local evidence to prove the claims made in the media or in the civil society organizations' reports. And so I now move on to a particular example where there are kind of several cases that one can actually study, but this particular one is a case study of a transmission technology that is which used conduct wireless loop. The initiators described it as an advanced wireless access system. I will quickly run through these slides. It was developed in the IIT Chennai, and the claim was that it was capable of providing a relatively low cost but rapid installation of telecom services in rural areas. But the kind of politics of technology that played out in the sector in the sector actually formed a continuous tussle between indigenous innovator and foreign providers of competitive substitutes who had already entered the market following liberalization of the telecommunications sector. I mean, at least this is how the initiators themselves perceived the whole dynamics. Then immediately when this was introduced, there was competition from multinational companies, and one of the things that the innovator wanted was the state to intervene on their behalf and withdraw all the kind of soaps given to multinational companies. To quote them, a dramatic decline in the value of India's GSM stocks generated heated political debate and resulted in a legal battle that has reached the Indian Supreme Court. Wireless loop is a typical representative of a disruptive technology. Over 4 million Indian consumers were using wireless loop instead of cellular GSM services. Wireless loop uses radio waves to connect customers to the nearest telephone exchange. There was this import duty concessions and other soaps to the MNCs, which the indigenous innovator found as a major impediment to their growth. They argued that it was not a mere coincidence that the soaps were given out to MNCs. To quote one of the persons who initiated this, just when our field trial was getting completed and the production was starting, the concessions were announced not for all telecom equipment but for wireless loop. Was this done because the indigenous development in this area was to be thwarted? So this led to a whole war in the media regarding what kind of liberalization policies can be pursued in the wireless sector, and finally some of the soaps given to MNCs were withdrawn. This is a long winding quotation that that exemplifies the kind of threat that the indigenous innovator faced in terms of competition from MNCs once this product was brought to the I want to emphasize that in the social innovations, role of the state cannot be undermined, and the case of the Kodak well, which I don't have time to go into the details of that debate, but shows clearly well that the innovation system, the kind of fragmented, the fractured nature of relationship between civil society and the state is an important issue that one should take into account while understanding the whole debate on the relationship between information and communication technologies and development. So I think I will stop here, and then if there are any questions, I'll take during the time of discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Strikum. I'm sorry we ran out of time, but I'm sure everybody who has an interest in your topic will speak to you afterwards. Our next speaker, I'll hand over to Willem to introduce the last three speakers.
Thank you, Naya. And our next speaker is Professor John Forjay, from the Department of Political Science, University of Yaoundé, Cameroon. And John Forget is widely published in various issues and an expert on science and politics in Africa. And he's going to speak this afternoon on regional-based innovation surveys. Do we need them, and for what?
Chair, thank you very much. I wish to thank my friends from the Cape and Human Science Research Council who felt that I should revisit my grassroots. I left here in the Scandinavian countries about some 25 years ago. And so they felt that I should come and celebrate part of the Norwegian National Day, which comes up on the 17th. Regional-based innovation surveys, do we need them, and for what reason? The first thing that comes to mind is simply this: how many Africas are there? We may talk of 3 or 4 Africa: the developed, the developing, underdeveloped, and extra underdeveloped. So, this innovation surveys we want to carry out, is it for which particular country? The next thing we have to bear in mind is that Africa is a compound, complicated, and confusing continent. And all this we have to take into consideration. And so I thought, given the degree of differences within the African continent, if you look at the Cape, look at Cairo, look at Banjul, look at the Horn, there's a wide difference. And so when we talk of the innovation system, where do we place Chad, Gabon, in comparison with South Africa, Egypt, or even Nigeria? It becomes even more complex. And so I thought maybe the best way to look at it would be to start looking at posing a number of questions. What does a regional-based innovation system mean for Africa? And then when you want to look at all these things, you can't talk of an innovation system when you don't have the manpower capacity. Now, what practical steps are needed in order to construct such a body? And so these are some of the things that come to mind when we are trying to look at regional innovation system. For me, I thought it could be a way of trying to mobilize the African continent. And it could be a way of trying to create a kind of a vision for national development. And then a way of enhancing exchange information and knowledge. And also a way of trying to create a kind of linkage among African countries. We also need to look at indigenous knowledge. So looking at the conceptual framework, we go back again to the whole history of modernization theory, capitalist theory, leadership theory, corruption theory, latecomer theory, structural adjustment program, and so on and so forth. How all this have impacted on the development of Africa, and especially the structural adjustment program. Has it helped Africa? Or has it created social added problems to the African continent? And especially SAP, when SAP tells you you have to cut down social amenities. I think the World Bank says Africa does not need universities. And then how can you start having innovations when tertiary education is not encouraged, when there's no means of research? Of course, we can also think of research of indigenous people. But then how do we popularize this research and bring it into line with modern technology and with modern development? So for me, I thought the regional-based innovation system could be a way of building capacities for the continent. It could also be a way of trying to mobilize resources for the various countries. Should we also look at it on the basis of regional economic communities? Can it be looked from that perspective? And try to see how we can link these innovation systems with regional economic groupings. And so I come to a conclusion. And this conclusion has something to do with what I said, confusing, because there are two conclusions. The conclusion is, the first one is that we should look at it as a working towards an alternative, since our regional economic communities seem to have failed. And we should look at it as a kind of a marriage between the academia and the grassroots. And for the grassroots, we have indigenous knowledge, which is not being utilized. And it also means that indigenous knowledge, they can be creative, they can be innovative. But how do we bring this knowledge to a wider public? And therefore, I advance the recommendation that facing challenges in Africa due to poor governance. Well, we've been talking about poor governance. How many countries on the continent still carry out the governance system? Corruption is still high. My country in particular has received the Olympic medal of being a corrupt country for more than two to 3 years running. But then when we want to talk about this regional innovation system, we need to build the human capacity. And then we need to have good governance as part of the whole system. Now, how did I go about it? Time was very short, so I depended mostly on observation and already published materials in trying to piece together the various development activities. Now, the key findings. One, you will discover that there's a kind of slow innovation in Africa. There's lack of creativity, and many factors contribute to that. Inadequate use of indigenous knowledge. We are not using our indigenous knowledge. And of course, it goes back to the colonial history. There's insufficient human capital development and utilization. Inadequate resources mobilization and utilization. Insufficient institutional capacity building, insufficient funding. I think the only country on the continent which is doing much in respect of funding is South Africa. Now, some issues of discussion and implications. How do we overcome some of the problems being faced by African countries? Could we use it as a way of articulating a new vision and understanding of the challenges facing them, or facing African countries? Can the regional innovation system be used to forge national unity? National unity within a country, because if you take a country like Cameroon, we have 230 tribes, 230 different languages. So, could it be used to forge even national unity, forge regional interlinkages, and then continental unity? Now, can it be used in creating the future? If we have these surveys, innovation system, for what purpose? What is the goal? Would it just be another SAP? That the next day, a new terminology comes in and the old one is thrown out. And then we start again from Genesis. So my conclusion is that it's a marriage. It should be a marriage between academia, grassroots, just like the interface between civil society, the state, and the private sector. So we can't talk of innovation system when there is no linkage between the state, civil society, and the private sector. That linkage is not there. The state alone cannot do everything. We need the private sector in order to put in place some of the necessary research facilities and to be part of the development process. Now, there are some recommendations for partly improving research and improving good governance. And I think a major key factor underscoring the problem of Africa is that of leadership. Unless we are able to address the issue of leadership, capacity building, and institutional building, I don't think we'll be able to make progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John Forjay. Our next speaker is Professor Sunil Mani, who's professor to the Center for Development Studies in Kerala, India. He was previously the research fellow and head of graduate studies at the United Nations University Institute for New Technologies, now known as Merit. And he's going to talk on the progressive nature of, no, he's changed his talk. It's going to be called Empirical Implementation of the National System of Innovation Framework.
Yeah, first of all, I wish to thank the HSRC for having invited me, and I've had a long association with the HSRC doing various kinds of studies. I must also thank Dr. Dimitri Labadarios for taking the initiative of inviting me. My presentation is actually on the empirical implementation of the concept of national system of innovation, because I think this, as Fred has also been mentioning, this particular framework has been in the currency, in the literature for the last 20 years or so, and to me it looks like it has gone out of control. And I think it's important to actually bring this concept to some empirical reality, and what I propose is actually a way of doing so. So I start with the main purpose of this exercise, which is actually an empirical implementation of this particular framework. And I make out a case for this because I think an adoption of this particular framework, as Fred has been mentioning as well, is that it can reduce the distance, technological distance, which developing countries will have to travel to reach the technology frontier, which, as you know, is fast changing all the time. And then I will go into the systemic perspective in a very brief manner, and then I will go into the various steps which are involved in this empirical implementation, and which the most important step is to define the core of the system, and we need to identify what constitutes the core in various types of economies. And then what happens in terms of innovative activities within the core, and how do you actually collect information, and how do you actually use, for instance, innovation surveys, which Fred again talked about. And I end with some 4 critical issues in the empirical implementation of this particular concept. The first one is the basic assumption is that the adoption of a national system of innovation framework would actually increase the amount of innovations which are taking place within an economy. So in fact, you find that many countries in the world are explicitly using this term. And in fact, South Africa is one of the first countries to actually very explicitly use this term when it became independent in 1994. And when the first white paper was formed, you find that the term national system of innovation was actually used in a very explicit fashion. And now many countries are actually tending to use this term. And in fact, I hold the view that in a number of cases, I think it is used only in a form and not in content. And now, if you look at the distance which developing countries have to travel to reach the technological frontier, and if you divide 2 major sectors in a developing country's economy, of course you have 3 major sectors. You have the primary sector, you have the secondary sector dominated by the manufacturing sector, and then you have the services sector. Now, in terms of the primary sector, the most important component is agriculture, and it is assumed that the core of agriculture research is largely done by public sector organizations in large number of developing countries, and indeed even in developed countries as well. Although with the arrival of biotechnology, you find that a number of business enterprises have actually become very important in the area of agriculture research. Now, if you look at agriculture research, what you find here is that if you take the average research intensity, that is agriculture R&D divided by agriculture GDP, okay, and that for developing countries as a whole has virtually remained same it's about 0.52% of the GDP is actually spent on agriculture. And given the importance of agriculture to these economies, you can see that although in individual economies there may be some slight increases in the agriculture research intensity, overall agriculture research intensities are virtually remain same at about 0.5% of the GDP. On the other hand, if you look at the high-income countries, what you find is that the agriculture research intensities have actually increased from 1.41% of the GDP to about 2.36. So 0.5 to 2.36 is the kind of technological distance which developing countries will have to travel if they want to actually catch up. And this is in the case of agriculture research. Now, if you look at industrial research, I tend to use the patents, although, as Fred said, it's not exactly a very good measure of innovations and so on, but this is what you have actually on the table to measure. And there are two kinds of distances I've actually estimated. One is if you take the total number of patents which are issued to inventors from developing countries in the US, for instance. And I can explain to you why exactly I'm taking the US patents during the discussions. And then you take that as a percentage of the total number of US patents which are issued in the US. And that has actually increased from 3.5 to about 8%. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the share of developing countries in total world patents have actually increased quite tremendously during this period. But this increase is essentially due to the fact that you have two countries within that 8%, or which is important, which is basically Korea and Taiwan. And if you knock out those two countries, which is captured by distance 2, it plummets down. Say, for instance, 3.5 actually plummets down to about 0.63%, and 8% actually plummets down to about 1.53. But nevertheless, there has been an increase. So unlike in agriculture research, there has been a catching up of developing countries, at least a few developing countries, with that of the technological frontier as far as industrial research is concerned. Now, this, I would believe, is essentially due to a kind of subscription to a national system of innovation perspective for most of these developing countries, which have actually, and again, I must clarify, when I use the term developing countries, I only refer to about 8 or 9 countries and not to about 130 or 140 in the UN sense of the term. It's only about 8 or 9 developing countries which are technologically speaking active, reporting R&D expenditures and taking patents and so on. And so a large number of what is called developing countries are actually completely outside the purview of what we are discussing at all. And the systemic perspective actually got into the literature towards the late 1980s. Christopher Freeman was the first person to use this in the context of trying to explain why a country like Japan, for instance, have actually developed. And this has been now used by a number of researchers. And of course, you have Professor Luntwal and Professor Richard Nelson, who has actually pushed the frontier of this particular framework for quite some time. And unfortunately, this particular concept has remained at the level of describing the kind of institutions and incentive systems which are available in an economy to innovate. So basically, people who tend to use this framework simply describes the number of actors which are actually available within a nation's economy to innovate, and the linkages between these actors. And very often these linkages between these actors, which is a dynamic process, cannot be measured because we really do not have any kind of summary measures to, for instance, to measure the link between one actor and the other actor. So basically the exercise has been simply to describe the various kinds of institutions and incentive systems which are available in various nations' economies. Now, I think it's, if you want to empirically implement this particular concept and to make the innovation policy a little bit more scientific, in the sense that if you want to identify those particular activities which results in innovation, and if you want to actually design instruments to impact on those activities, then you need to have an empirical implementation of this particular concept. So for that, you need to, among the various actors, you need to define one actor as the core of the innovation system. And in fact, based on a number of empirical research, it's possible to say that the core of the innovation system in most national systems of innovation is increasingly business enterprises. And it is the place where most of the innovations are actually done, although this may not be the case in a large number of developing countries, where government is a major performer of and financier of various innovative activities. But increasingly, most developing countries which have actually innovated, for instance, Korea, for instance, Taiwan, for instance, Japan, China, and for instance, Brazil and India and South Africa and so on, all these countries, you find that increasingly business enterprises are actually become the most important actor within the innovation system. And so the first step is to identify the core of an innovation system. And in fact, I can give you some ideas of how to identify the core of an innovation system. And the second step is to, after having identified the core of an innovation system, you need to find out what goes on within the core in terms of what Fred referred to as innovative activity. Okay, and so that's the second step. The third step is once you have actually identified those key innovation activities and expenditures, then you need to list them out. And then, for instance, Fred listed out a number of innovation activities and expenditures, starting with intramural R&D, acquisition of capital goods, training, and so on. So these are various innovation activities and expenditures. And in step 4, then you can actually find out which of those innovation activities are actually most important among the various, like if you have 6 different activities, which are the ones which are most important within the core, which actually drives innovation. And then in step 4, you can actually design policy instruments to impact on those activities, so those activities can be enhanced. And so this is quite different from an old system where you actually simply assume that firms do innovations essentially through intramural R&D. And so what you require is essentially a tax incentive or some form of surreptitious subsidy schemes to essentially encourage firms to commit more resources to R&D. And perhaps if you argue that this is not the way in which firms actually innovate, and those instruments may not be very scientific. So that's basically the point that I'm trying to make. So first, in terms of identifying the core of an innovation system, you need to actually measure innovation in some way or other. So the only thing that is available across the world, although innovation surveys are available for some developing countries and indeed for Europe and so on, for majority of the developing countries, you really do not have innovation surveys. So ultimately, you have to draw upon the R&D expenditure data as intramural R&D expenditure data as a way of identifying the core. So if you look at the core, and if you divide the economy into 4 different actors: business enterprises, government, higher education, and private non-profit enterprises, and so on, which is basically civil society organizations, which Sri Kumar has been talking about. You find that in a number of countries, increasingly the core is becoming the business enterprises. This is in terms of performance, not in terms of financing the activity. Even if the business enterprises are the core, the financing of that particular thing can be by the government through some sort of subsidies and so on. So you find that a number of countries, it is actually business enterprises. And in fact, if you actually trace this data over a period of time, you find that in a number of countries which have become successful innovators, the core has actually shifted to business enterprises. For instance, Korea. If you look at Korea in the 1970s, 80% of the R&D was actually performed by government organizations. And if you look at Korea in 2009, you find that about 20% of R&D is actually done by government, and 80% is actually done by business enterprises. And you can see the phenomenal increase in innovative activity in that country. If you look at China, for instance, which is again another country which one likes to talk about, you find that in 1979, when the country started liberalizing, about 80% of the R&D was actually done by government or universities and research institutes and so on. And if you look at 2009, about 64 or 65% of the R&D in China is actually performed by business enterprises. So you can see that the core has actually shifted from government to business enterprises. And this is extremely important for the simple reason that if research institutes and universities and government actually do research and business enterprises do production, and then bridging a link between the two is an extremely difficult and in fact almost an impossible task. So you have this eternal discussion on university-industry linkages which goes on in various countries, and you do not have any kind of really good model. And again, as Sri Kumar was saying, only anecdotal information about some successful cases from one country or other, and you don't have any good cases where there is a very good university-industry linkage which is taking place. So the core has to be business enterprises. Now, within the once you have identified the core, now in step 2, you have to look at within the core how do actually firms innovate. And for this, you can actually raise at least 4 different or 3 different questions. First, the routes through which business enterprises innovate, especially those non-R&D routes, because as Fred has been saying, that increasingly it's been found out that many, especially small firms and so on, they don't have an explicit intramural in-house R&D center, but they do innovate. So you need to identify those non-R&D innovation routes through which firms innovate. So that's the first task. Yeah, the second one is actually the source of information to the firms. Again, Fred referred to this one. How did these firms get the information to innovate? Did they get it from research institutes or laboratories or universities, or did they get it from their suppliers or users? And I think this is also very important, because then you can actually design instruments to enhance that particular linkage. So, and third factor is that those factors which constraints or hamper innovation activities, although many people know that this is actually due to financial, one of the speakers also referred to the entrepreneurial activity, but finance is an important requirement. So the answers to all these questions are actually available in this so-called innovation surveys, as we have mentioned, as originally arose in the context of Europe, and it is actually, this particular technology has now diffused to a large number of developing countries, and in fact South Africa has been one of the important countries which have been doing innovation surveys. They have done one official innovation survey, and a second official innovation survey, I understand, is in the process. And Brazil has actually done 2 official innovation surveys, and Malaysia has done 3 official innovation surveys, and so on. And a large number of Latin American countries have actually done. But what have we learned from the results of this innovation surveys? And the first point is that the number of firms which actually innovate are, according to the surveys, is actually very high. For instance, if you look at the South African survey, approximately 50% of the firms claimed that they have actually introduced some new innovations in the field. So the rate of innovative activity measured through the innovation surveys is actually very high. And second is that if you look at the most important innovation activity and expenditure, you find that it is not intramural R&D, but acquisition of machinery, capital goods, software, and so on. And this seems to be the most important thing in most of the countries, excepting for Malaysia, for instance, where they say it's extramural R&D, which is actually more purchase of R&D inputs from outside is actually very, very important. And in fact, you find that importance of intramural R&D is not very important in most countries. In terms of their share, it doesn't exceed more than 1/3 of the total expenditures. And you find that source of information, which I talked about, the second question that I talked about, the source of information in all the countries which have actually done innovation surveys, in fact, what you find is a remarkable statistical regularity across the countries of all hues and shapes, is that customers and suppliers are the most important source of information for innovation, and not universities and laboratories, and this is what Fred has also been saying. And so if you talk about enhancing university-industry linkage to promote innovations, that I think is a completely wasteful form of activity. And if you look at the factors hampering innovation, again, you find that it is basically the cost of doing innovations, which is, again, the financial point that I've talked about. And lastly, the important thing is that although governments have a number of instruments for promoting innovations, these are not important for the firms, because those instruments are not the routes through which firms innovate. So if you have an R&D tax incentive, and if R&D is not the route through which firms innovate, then it's not going to be very effective in terms of driving innovation expenditure. So finally, I conclude with the 4 critical issues which are very important. First, you need to have a fairly clear definition of innovation, because this is a very culture-specific context. And so that may be one of the reasons as to why you find that in many of the developing countries where innovation surveys have been done, their firms claim that they have actually introduced innovations because something which is new to them, even if it's not new to the universe in which they are located, they tend to exaggerate that question. The second one is that if you want to really use innovation survey data for designing policy purposes and make that science of innovation policy scientific, then the response rates to the surveys are very important. So the response rates have to be reported. And as you know, the response rates are always defined with respect to the sample and not with respect to the population. And so when you, and even with respect to the sample, if it's a very low response rate, as indeed the case in a number of countries, excepting for South Africa, then perhaps the results of the innovation surveys are not generalizable for the entire sample and not even for the population. And given the fact that the sample itself is a small percentage of the population, and then that can be problematic. The third point is that I refer to innovation activities and expenditures, and I also refer to the fact that the acquisition of capital goods is actually an important item through which firms innovate. And if firms do not maintain that innovation activities and expenditures properly, then you have a huge measurement error there, and so then you might be actually measuring something wrongly, and in which case, again, the designing scientifically innovation policy instruments based on the innovation surveys can be sometimes problem. And lastly, what one finds is that although innovation surveys have been done, it has resulted in large number of academic publications, and not many countries have actually used innovation surveys for designing policy instruments. And the most important example is actually Europe itself, because here in Europe, you don't have a Lisbon target defined in terms of innovation expenditures, but still in terms of R&D expenditures. You are saying that 3% of R&D expenditure to GDP is still as the target to be working towards, and not 3% of innovation expenditures to GDP as the so you see that it's not being used. And so I think the most important thing is that you need to define the core of the innovation system, and you need to find out what happens within the core in terms of innovative activity through innovation surveys. But if you do innovation surveys, those points of caution that I mentioned will have to be borne in mind. So I just thank you for.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Our sixth speaker for this session is Professor Wesley Schramm. He's Professor of Zoology at Louisiana State University in the United States and Secretary of the Society for Social Studies of Science. And he's going to talk on collaboration, productivity, and networking in African science.
And I'm Secretary of the Society for Social Studies of Science, which was going to try to sponsor a session here, but didn't make it. Do I have to? Yeah, we are recording. Oh, you're recording, okay, that's okay. Have to appreciate the audio. HSRC did the job, and hopefully we'll be here next time with a sponsored session. I don't know how to spell collaboration, obviously. I wanted to start out with this little picture, which is kind of our inspiration after the fact for the study of the internet in Africa. And I always been focusing mainly on the science and educational communities. But this photo was taken when the internet was in its infancy, and it's taken, it's one of the matatus in Kenya, in Nairobi, which is taken through the cracked windshield of another vehicle. And it's interesting because there wasn't really no internet in Kenya to speak of, but nonetheless the idea of the internet was already there. This project that I'm going to talk about today is probably the worst named project in the history of the world, and it was really developed because we were doing a science and engineering event for the World Summit on the Information Society in Tunisia. And one of my graduate students wanted to make up business cards and said, well, why don't we just call it the World Science Project? That's the name of the website for the Tunisia event. So then we had to think of why it was called the World Science Project. So we like these three big points. Well, the project of modern science is the kind of obvious one. The specific group of studies that we were doing in Africa and Asia mainly, but a little bit in Latin America. And if you know American slang, sometimes when you see a young child torturing a bug, you may call it a science project. The idea of in fact, I think I have one more. Yeah, I'll go back and forth. The central area that we defined gradually was a kind of intersection of these three intellectual fields. One is STS, Science and Technology Studies, development, and as it occurred over the years, ICTs, but that wasn't the original focus of the study. The perspective that we take is very much a social networks perspective, and it always was. But instead of the concept of development, we're tending now to use this terminology of reagency, which we think is a better expression of what it is that sociologists should be studying in the certain parts of the world. And I'm not going to, it's not a conceptual talk here, it's really a findings talk, so I won't say too much about that, except that much of what is going on in Africa with respect to the funding of research and information and communication technologies is the story of the transmission of resources. And if you follow the paths, follow the money might be one joking way of putting it, but if you follow the paths that those resources travel and the uses to which the money is put, you learn much more about what's going on than if you think about the idea of development, which is a kind of wishy-washy idea to begin with. So anyway, the specific project has been going on since 1994, and I would love to say that it was all designed in advance, especially because it turned out so well, but I'm going to have to be more honest than that. It was always focused on 3 countries that were decided by the Dutch government. My only input was to say that they had to be English-speaking, because I didn't really know any other language. So they wanted a kind of low, medium, and high level of development in their terminology. And so roughly in that order would be Ghana, Kenya, and India, but we only studied the southwestern corner of India, which is Kerala. So they really picked those countries, and my thought was, you know, one of the problems is switching around your countries all the time. Stick with your countries. So I've always done that. I had some students that later picked up, well, South Africa was a different story, really. It wasn't a student, but a guy that moved. The Philippines and Chile were later tacked on, but the countries that I've really focused on since 15 years have been Ghana, Kenya, and Kerala. Now, sometimes you could say 1994 was the beginning of the internet, or was the year that Al Gore invented the internet, or there are various ways of putting it, but it's an early year, and there certainly was not very much internet in these countries at that time. And as it became apparent that the internet was going to be a very big thing, not only in the US, but everywhere, the lucky break was that what we had done in '94 was to do a communication study, a social network survey of the science and education communities in these areas. And that was where I'd like to say, you know, it was designed, but it was just a lucky break. That's the kind of study that we did. We weren't planning to do an analysis of the impact of the internet, but, you know, it became so obvious that that would be a good thing to follow up on that we said, hey, let's do that. And so in about 1999 or so, we started thinking about it. And in 2000, 2001, we really got going in a serious fashion. And so pretty much every year now, some study is being done in these places, and it's become a longitudinal and panel study now, so that we could follow some of the same people. And we're getting ready for the I don't know if it'll be the last wave, but it'll be a wave. Maybe it'll be the last wave in 2010. It was supposed to be this year, but I pushed it a little bit. And like I said before, the methods that we have been using were originally based on a study in the United States. I kind of lost interest in the United States and then started going to these other places. But they're basically social network surveys, so that you can get some kind of an estimate of the degree to which people are connected to various sectors, locations, the degree to which they have networks that are larger or smaller in size, and various other things. But the new method that we started working on in about 2002 was what we came to call video ethnography, which was more of a qualitative method. We had done qualitative interviews before, but we then kind of pushed that pretty strongly in the past 5 years. And I would like to say that well, the rest of the talk is just some findings, but I'd like to just use 1 minute of my time to say that this is a really great example of a method that was really innovated for us in Africa, being very useful in the United States, because we started all our work really in Kenya and Ghana and India, and then when Hurricane Katrina hit, I'm from Louisiana, we realized that we had a skill of this video ethnography that really needed to be used at home. So then for the past 4 years, we've been doing a lot of this very close to home, following up the aftermath of the hurricane. And right now is the largest lawsuit in the history of the world going on, and I'm racing back tomorrow to get to the end of it, the lawsuit against the U.S. government for the destruction of the city of New Orleans. It'd be interesting to see how that turns out. We did shift our methodology a little bit, but in 1994, I'm going to mention some of the findings that we used to kind of springboard the subsequent studies. And this is my one-sentence version of it. We started calling it the view from afar. If you're in the United States or Europe and you're studying science in Africa and Asia and Latin America, the tendency is to want to use publications and to use co-authorships and to use these kind of databases. And our feeling after being there for some time was that they just were not the best way of doing it, and they give you a very misleading picture of what's going on. The second thing was that if you look at the degree to which one is connected to the outside world, that is, if you're a Kenyan scientist or working at a government research institute in Ghana, there tends to be a situation where if you're more connected to the outside world, your external networks are larger, you tend to have smaller internal or domestic networks, so that the greater the one, the less the other. And we can see that as being potentially problematic. I don't know that I would necessarily call it problematic, but it could be potentially problematic in terms of one's orientation towards external science or internal problems. And finally, this kind of odd idea that was very counterintuitive to us, because we thought we would certainly find that those who were educated in developed countries would have more extensive networks in the developed countries. It only made sense. It was an obvious thing, but it wasn't true. So we were interested to kind of follow, especially some of these network things, as the internet and email and various ICTs became more important in the areas that we were studying. So we got this other fairly large grant from the National Science Foundation in the early 2000s to follow some of these things up. The idea being that if you can make communication very easy and very low cost, or almost even free sometimes for a researcher at an institute or a university, then wouldn't they be expected to expand their networks, and wouldn't they become more connected to the global scientific community? And in fact, we kind of defined the project as a globalization project. Is science in Africa going to become truly globalized? How much time do I have? I want to know how much to linger on this one.
You've got 1 minute, actually.
Okay, I have two more slides. Two more slides. The beginning of the problem was when we started focusing on collaboration as a process of interest, and we discovered, also to our surprise, that collaboration was not associated with any consistent increase in productivity. In fact, we had thought that people would become more connected, they would collaborate more, and they would become more productive. But it turned out it was only true among a small subset of the people that we were we were looking at. And one of the reasons for this is, and I wasn't going to talk about Kerala at all today, but Kerala would be a good example of this, that the problems people were experienced in undertaking collaborations were offsetting the benefits of the collaborations that they were involved in. And the people who were most productive, which was the Malayalis, the Indians that we were studying, had pretty decent internet use and pretty high productivity, but very little collaboration, at least in terms of external collaboration. So there was a lot of collaboration among the Kenyans and very low productivity. And that led us to some observations that we're trying to follow up on now. I'm sorry, I had actually one more. Well, I can skip this one. This is okay. That's kind of it's so interesting though, but I'll skip it anyway. Final one. We have found recently that there is starting to be a small increase in productivity in Africa, but it's not the international productivity that we expected. It's more domestic productivity. Okay? I feel that this is a pretty solid finding because it exists in the time periods, all the time periods that we've studied, that these Kenyan academics tend to have a benefit from collaboration, especially in terms of their international productivity. Now, the difference about Kenya than the other Africa places is that they're very closely linked to international institutes. There's a lot of big international institutes in Nairobi, so it still may not be that they're collaborating across international boundaries. They're just collaborating within their own city with international institutes, okay? And we have found that this is a pretty consistent finding as well, especially the agricultural researchers that you were mentioning earlier. Very little benefit to collaboration. I guess let me finish it here. The slide that I didn't talk about is the one that is sticking in my mind most right now, which is that during the course of this last 10 years, we intended to study the internet. Compared with the internet, the mobile phone is a much more significant technology for Africa. And it's kind of usurped the internet in terms of its importance. And we have found that the mobile phone is having possibly negative impacts on international communication for the reason that it's mostly a local form of communication. Uses up people's resources. And then finally, back to science, we have really not been, if we were going to offer advice to policymakers, we have not been able to confirm in any way that that promoting collaboration will somehow improve people's productivity or make people better scientists, or what tends to happen is that in Ghana and Kenya, the more you collaborate, the more problems you introduce for yourselves, and then you need the ICTs to reduce the problems that the collaboration has brought along with it, okay? So that there's no real net gain. And I guess that is the source of this collaboration paradox anyway. The conditions that undermine the relationship between collaboration and productivity, it probably undermines the collaborative benefits of the internet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to all 6 speakers for a very diverse set of presentations. I think it was a very difficult topic, and we had a wide range of presentations looking at various aspects of measuring R&D and innovation, as well as the problems and the activities in the process of implementing a national system of innovation. I'm not going to do a summary. I think there are more questions than answers. I would like to have a short panel discussion, and if all these presenters could come and sit in the front here, please. And then anybody from the audience, it's a very small audience, so it's going to be quite an intimate panel discussion, would please come up to the microphone so it gets recorded for the processes of the conference. So if all the speakers could please come up. Thanks. I don't think so. Also think that some of the presenters have got questions to ask each other. I think there were some quite different viewpoints raised.
I have one question.
If you could go. Yeah.
I have one question to Professor Foye. You talked about inadequate use of indigenous knowledge, and I'm not very experienced with this, so I would like to know whether you have a success story where indigenous knowledge was successfully used, and if there is such a success story, could you tell who used or who commercialized it, and what product or service it was?
Thank you very much. I think there's a degree of inadequate use of indigenous knowledge across the continent. But then we have success stories, because if you look at in terms of fertilization, the traditional people have their traditional way of fertilizing certain things. But this has not been put into commercial use. The problem is, how do we get this knowledge into a large scale production? The village woman or the village man has a certain type of knowledge, and this has been all along history. But the problem now is to link the village with the urban area. And to link that village, you need the academic world, the modern science, in order to do greater research.
16 countries.
Even in terms of traditional healing, there are certain traditional medicines which do heal, but we've not been able to incorporate that into the development process. But then this goes back to the colonial history. You see, what happened was that colonial history destroyed that traditional knowledge. For example, in science and technology, at one stage, you were penalized if you were a blacksmith. Why? Because the blacksmith was able to produce certain tools which were being used against the colonial masters. And so that helped even to bring down the state of technological development within the society.
Yes, please, Fred.
Could I actually raise an example? If you Google Chataway and Orbicon, you will get a publication in which the indigenous knowledge of the San people who wander around in a desert is discussed, and they would consume the hoodie plant with a view to not feeling hungry. So this, with the help of South African institutions, was commercialized so that obese people in developed countries could wander around not deserts, but cities, feeling not hungry. There are various controversies around all of this, but it's an interesting story.
Yeah.
No.
Yes, Salim. Sorry, would you come up to the microphone, please?
I'd like to pick up on the slide that had the word market about 6 times. And it's now triggered again by the word commercialized. Is innovation entirely about the market? You don't innovate if you don't commercialize? So I want to raise that first fundamental question. Because if that's a conception of innovation, then you also rule out, in some cases, entire universities from the national system of innovation, narrowly defined, or you rule out half of universities, which are essentially humanities, social science, arts institutions. So are we sure that innovation is entirely about the market and marketization and commercialization? Are there whole fields in the social sciences, in education, that ipso facto then cannot innovate? Is it entirely about commercialization? That's the first question. The second question is to the Indian colleague, the word catching up. Now, Immanuel Wallerstein makes a very profound point in an article that perhaps should be read much more about development, whether it's a lodestar or is an illusion. That catching up, this mantra of catching up, and social equality are two very different things. They're related, of course, but the history of the world has shown that they are not necessarily correlative. So, does the structure of your economy matter? Does the goals that you have to set yourself as a society matter? Do the normative dimensions matter? When we want to compare ourselves, as you did in that slide, between, in a sense, the gold standard is the more you are located in terms of your research and development in business enterprises, the better you are. Is there any relationship between that and the kind of society that you have and the kind of society that you want to build? Why is it necessarily that the more it's located in business enterprises, somehow the better you are? I don't see the logic of that. And that effaces entirely normative dimensions. And then the last part really is, I think, as the colleague from Cameroon has said, let's be careful of rushing in with technologies without answering the fundamental questions of what their purposes are.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. I don't know who wants to take the first one.
Let me deal with the slide with multiple recurrences of the market. That is the OECD definition of innovation, and that's what guides innovation surveys. Now, that said, and I'll get to ruling out universities in a moment, they aren't. There is a project going on as we sit here looking at public sector innovation. Whatever that means. Let's keep that word in inverted commas for the moment. But what they are doing is looking at the innovation activities, a list of which I provided, not exhaustive, which can be conducted in government, higher education, and the healthcare sector. Now, we can look at that and we can measure it and talk about it. The question is, what is our market substitute when we start talking about change? And that is where a certain amount of conceptual development has to go on. And that is going on, and that is a natural next step. But if we are measuring Schumpeterian innovation, then that slide holds, because that is what is in the Oslo manual. Now, universities, research hospitals, and government departments are very much part of the innovation system, which my colleague developed in his talk. And this gets us to knowledge flows and framework conditions. I talked largely about the private sector, but the private sector is surrounded by regulation and other constraints provided by the society, and also sources of knowledge and incentives. So there is a whole world around the firm which is doing the innovation, and there's a great deal of work around that. So it is not excluded, it is part of the innovation system. So I think those are the two directions that that you raised in your talk. And with universities, we still have the knowledge flows embodied in graduates. We have disembodied knowledge floating around, some of it protected by intellectual property instruments, all of which are quite important. So that's my piece. I will now hand over to somebody else to do the rest.
Professor Forger.
Well, I think the bottom line of every development activities is to improve the quality of livelihood. And once you miss that, then development doesn't mean anything. The next thing is that there's an absence of a linkage between the university, the research institute, and the private sector, and the consumer. So you find in most developing countries, the research results are there, but they gather dust because of that absence of a linkage. For example, in Cameroon now and in other African countries, they've been able to discover, call it tablets or whatever, for malaria. But then that absence of the linkage between the research institute and the market sector is not there in order to produce those tablets in a quantity, quantitatively to meet the development needs. So again, we come back to the simple issue, development for whom and for what purpose? And it goes back again to leadership. Do we have servant leaders or do we have served leaders? Unfortunately, on the African continent, we have served leaders, leaders who want their population to serve them instead of them serving their population. And that is where the mix, there's a bad mix in the whole structure.
Thank you. And the guy from India?
Yeah. Well, I think I thank you for your question. I think it's quite a tension between promoting technological innovation and in that process, the growth of inequalities that you find in the economy. And as you can see, that innovation policy cannot address those questions at all. I mean, these will have to be addressed by other policies. Now, innovation policy is actually part of a large package of other policies which the governments have. So I think you need to invoke those other policies like income policies and so on to actually reduce the inequalities that might arise during this growth process. But I believe catching up with the technology frontier is extremely important because otherwise you do not find that the inequality question itself can be tackled. Even when research was increasingly done by and performed within government organizations, you had a fair amount of inequalities in existence. It's not as if inequalities were not there at all when research was being done in the public sector. It was quite there. In fact, a number of cases you find that the productivity of such investments were also pretty low. Okay, so I think it's important to give importance to the private sector in terms of research activities, although in the financial crisis has dented our faith in the private sector, but this is due to various other kinds of innovations, say for instance financial innovations, which may not be called innovation strictly speaking. And so on. If you tend to attach the term innovations with all kinds of activities, then there you have that kind of problems.
Yes.
Well, I have a different view of catching up. If we look at the Rostow stages of development, and then if we take the Gresham-Kohn story of development, the latecomer advantage, you may say some developing countries can catch up as a result of science and technology. Because I think it was 1966 when Sweden introduced color television. Any African country or third world country starting a television network today goes straight into color, not to go again in white and black. So there's a degree of catching up in that aspect. But that catching up is the result of science and technology, which helps them to jump 2 or 3 ridges. We do not need to go back to invent the wheel, especially in developing countries. But then it's a question of what do you do now? You have what I call the technology of mobility, the technology of violence, and the technology of knowledge. Now, do you use this technology for destruction, or do you use the technology for development? And the problem, again, in Africa is that technology is not being used for development, because even with the catching up, most African countries spend their money on weapons. So how do we convert that technology of destruction into a kind of technology for development?
I'm not going to speak again. I don't want to hog the floor, and I think there should be other questions. Catching up is not about refusing to build societies in underdeveloped societies that offer people a quality of life. It's putting at issue the model, because you don't have to be poor imitators and mimics. The idea that every underdeveloped society can catch up, as if the model is the United States, where a population of 15% consumes 35% of the world's resources. The idea that every country can catch up like that will destroy the planet. So I'm not opposed to catching up in a sense of using technology, knowledge, wherever it may come from. But it's putting at issue the nature of what you want to catch up with. What's the purposes of development? It cannot be simply mimicry, imitation of a certain gold standard, which is not sustainable in this planet. And therefore, exactly, why do we mimic the OECD definitions of innovation? Because in our societies, it's not just about innovation of an economic or a business nature. It's about innovating in our schooling systems. It's in innovating around social cohesion in a country where there are 230 languages and so on. The OECD does not have the same dimension of problems that we have, and in terms of what we must innovate for. So mimicry and imitation is not helpful if we are serious about development.
Great, thank you.
On behalf of the OECD, let me make two observations. We've seen a lot of measurement of innovation going on in different parts of the world. And we've seen two models. Within Africa, the African Union, through the NEPAD Office of Science and Technology, has been running an innovation measurement program for some years, which is beginning to show interesting results. They are measuring innovation now in 18 or 19 countries. And with the first intergovernmental meeting on the subject in Maputo in 2007, they looked at definitions and ways of dealing with this very problem which you present. And they decided to begin with adopting the OECD manuals because an enormous amount of intellectual and conceptual work had gone into those things, and they are very expensive to maintain, I can tell you. But the idea was to go out and do the measurements and discover the problems and raise some of the issues that you have just raised, and then develop guidelines and interpretations appropriate to African countries or African regions. And that is working. It's taking a while to take those definitions, inappropriate though you may think them to be, and to apply them. Second example is Latin America. They looked at the situation, said roughly what you just said, and wrote the Bogota Manual, and then went out and applied it. They discovered how expensive it is to keep a manual current. And when the Oslo Manual was being revised, 2003, 2005, 3 years out of my life, I can tell you, they came along and said, how about adding an annex to the Oslo Manual which interprets it for use in developing countries? And the UNESCO Institute of Statistics agreed to coordinate that, and the annex was added. So we begin to talk to one another, and the Bogota Manual is no longer used in Latin America. So it's an important aspect of opening the discourse so that we all influence one another. And the OECD is quite open to considering the points that you have raised, and is indeed running a project on public sector innovation to draw in the questions that you pose. So, we listen.
Okay, thank you for that. Dimitri?
Dimitri Labadaris from South Africa. To the IT, for the two presenters on IT, any just brief, I know it's 4 o'clock, any brief thoughts as to the reasons why ICT use does not seem to live up to the expectations or the promotions that it will do this and this and this and improve that and that and that, and your findings seem to contradict that. Any ideas why?
I'll quickly try to respond to this question. Thank you for raising this. There is actually a very huge gap between the promises that these civil society organizations made on behalf of their interventions on ICT programs and the kind of things that they could actually deliver to the rural people. I mean, one of the important things that that undermine the whole project of ICT's deployment in rural areas is that it did not take into consideration the rural social structure. It promised, I mean, on the face of it, it promised that it can bridge divides. Whereas, the introduction of new technologies in a rural setting is a very complex process where, the social dynamics is much more important than, your enthusiasm for introducing something quite new into a particular setting. So wherever it was introduced, for example, there are cases where, these technologies were supposed to eliminate middlemen. But when you try to introduce it in the rural areas, I mean, you first have to contact the rural elite. Only with your permission can you enter, the village and begin the project. Second thing is that you need resources to run the project. I mean, you need electricity, you need space. And it is the temples and, in the rural elite who could actually provide such resources for the everyday, to meet the everyday establishment cost of these initiatives. So there are various, kind of ways in which the rural elite was actually getting a grip over the actual implementation process of these initiatives. This is one reason. And second, like there was this discussion on the indigenous knowledge systems. There was a complete, lack of awareness on the ways and modes of, use of indigenous knowledge. How to incorporate that into these initiatives. One of the things that I noticed, I mean, when I went to fieldwork in Pondicherry, which is in South India, there was this huge claim made by this an organization that they are providing weather information to the fisherfolk, which is actually quite helpful for them because when they go into the sea, I mean, if there is a storm coming up, then they can know in advance and then stay back home. I mean, initially, my impulse was to believe this. I mean, this is true. I mean, and there are two interesting, kind of part to the story. One is that I went to the sea coast and there were these fishermen. I asked them, they are saying that they are providing this information. How valuable is this information for you? I mean, as an outsider, I can understand that this is very valuable. I mean, they said that your fish catch has increased, your risk has reduced because of this weather information that they are able to provide you. What actually they do is that they download the weather information from the US Navy website and then, kind of value add, there is some value added by translating it into a local language. That is exactly what the organization is doing. Then this, they were smiling at themselves and smiling at me. And then I couldn't understand, why they were smiling when I asked them this particular question, the value of the information that this organization is providing them. They said, I mean, after some, kind of, nudging, they said that we have been living here for quite some time. And looking at the movement of the clouds and the shape of the clouds, we are able to, project the weather conditions. Why we still go into the sea is that if we don't go, then our children will starve. Now, if you go into the sea after the organization announces that there is going to be a storm, there is a stigma. You didn't listen to it and then you still went. So it's actually an inconvenience for us that this organization is, formalizing this channel of information. The second part of it is that about the incremental value of innovation. So I went into a government organization, the agricultural department, asked them, the civil society organization is providing so many kind of services to the rural people. So what are you going to do? They said that we are also going to provide weather information. Then I said, oh, what is the difference? I mean, one organization is already claiming that they're providing it. Then they said, no, there is a difference. They are actually providing the weather information from the US Navy website, whereas we will be giving it from the CNN website.
Thank you very much for those last humorous comments. I think we need to finish off now. It's past that time. Unless you want to, is it going to be quick?
Well, I have one. I'll
Okay.
just do it from here, because you
Yeah,
can
that's
still
fine.
record that.
That's fine.
This is the unshown slide. This is mobile phones. And in Kerala, this is longitudinal. The introduction of mobile phones has decreased the size of people's core networks, core social networks. In Kenya, the introduction of mobile phones has increased people's totally different effects on people's networks. And we think we can explain that because in Kenya, people really use mobile phones for instrumental purposes. Africans don't, I mean, they do send a lot of text messages and so forth, but the key difference is that they're using them to solve problems of life that they get involved with. In Kerala, which is more like the United States, even though it might not seem like it, that it's probably awful to say, but they're using it to keep in touch with their family and friends. So they actually sort of close their networks around them rather than open them up. And it's the way people use the technologies that it's not less successful in Kerala just because it has this seemingly negative. It is successful in Kerala, so that's what I would say about ICTs.
Thank you, Wesley. Okay, I'd like to thank all the speakers for their presentations, and that's very good. And I think this panel discussion brought all the different presentations together a bit more. And thank you to the audience for their participation, and to Professor Salim Badat for your stimulating questions. And thank you to everybody for attending. Okay.